Yo, what's up? Let's go. What's up, everyone? Hope everyone's having a good night. Shouts out to our homeboy out there, Jerry, at Exposing Powerful Lies live streams. Hope everybody checked out his stream tonight. Hope everyone's having an awesome night. What's up, everyone? Tonight we are covering Shakespeare's King Lear, monumental play, one of his 4 tragedies. Y'all, we're making some good headway here. We've covered a lot of Shakespeare. Just as a quick recap, okay, we've covered Hamlet. We're now covering King Lear. We started off with Macbeth. We have one more traditional Shakespearean tragedy to go, right? One of his 4 Shakespearean tragedies. We have Othello to go. So, of course, now we're going to have to cover that. We've also covered Richard III, Henry V, Romeo and Juliet. We've covered Milton. We've covered John Webster, the Duchess of Malfi. We've covered lots and lots of Renaissance, Elizabethan, and Shakespearean drama. We've also covered modern poetry, modern literature, modern prose, novels. We've done a pretty good survey of the canon so far here. So, of course, tonight, we're making our way through Shakespeare's 1600s tragedy, King Lear. And this play is unlike any of his other plays. I mean, it's a quite a difficult play to get through, you guys. You may have read King Lear. This might be your first foray into King Lear or into Shakespeare at all or into Shakespearean tragedy. I'm going to discuss, again, I'm going to sort of recap what constitutes a Shakespearean tragedy. Of course, that's slightly different from the Aristotelian concept of a tragedy or the classical Greek concept of a tragedy. And we're going to look at, as we always do, the form, content, and meaning, how the literature, how the text appears on the page, how it hits the ear, and how those things coalesce to produce meaning and to give us a worldview. This play is unlike many of Shakespeare's other plays, especially unlike his other tragedies, because it is so dark. It is so dark, and one could walk away from this play saying there's no redemption in it. There are a number of different ways one could look at the play. I mean, I know that in the neoclassical era that followed the Renaissance, and then later on in the Romantic era, the play was sort of, first of all, it was rewritten, which violates one of the classical rules of Shakespeare, adding to the text. Remember that we've said a number of times that one of the rules for Shakespeare, especially when you have a Shakespearean film, right? When you have a Shakespearean film or when you have a play version, you cannot add to the text because you ruin the integrity of the work as a whole. You can take away text, but you can't add to it. Well, they violated this with the melodrama especially of the 18th and 19th century on the stage. But later on, the play was sort of revitalized and is often performed. But one of the things about King Lear, Anthony Hopkins, who recently played the title character, said that, every actor's dream is to play King Lear. But by the time you're old enough to play it, you're too old to play it. And what that essentially means is that one reason you don't see productions of Lear that often is that it truly takes an old actor to play it. You can't just have a young or a middle-aged actor dress up and put on a beard and play Lear. It's impossible. You can't do it. There's no way the play will be any good. You can't have a high school production of King Lear. You can do that with many other Shakespearean plays, but you can't do it with Lear because the title character really embodies certain things. I mean, that's what one of the things that the play is about. It's about old age. I would say it's about old age, madness, dementia, and the hard-won wisdom that comes with old age. But really, my thesis statement for the play is that it is, first of all, this is the worst family in the world. Truly. I mean, this is a terrible family. King Lear is a play that exists in sort of three separate time frames, but simultaneously. And that's an interesting concept just to dive into for a second. First of all, it's sort of outside the normal view of the Shakespearean play because we normally think of the locus of Shakespeare as being England and Italy, right? You have The Merchant of Venice. You have Othello set in Venice. You've got plays set in Padua. You've got Romeo and Juliet, etc. And then you've got the English plays. Now, of course, Hamlet is set in Denmark. Macbeth is set in Scotland, right? And you've got a few other plays that sort of kind of go outside of that sort of locus. But this one is different because it not only exists in Britain, but it's sort of a Britain outside of time. It specifically is supposed to exist in pre-Christian Albion, right? This is a sort of a Celtic, almost druidical place that exists sort of in the early stages of the first millennium, but certainly in a pre-Christian. I mean, the language of the play is specifically pagan. There are constant references to Jupiter and the Roman gods. But it's supposed to exist in three sort of time periods. One would be this sort of Celtic Albion, which is an ancient name for the British Isles. The second would be the time in which Shakespeare wrote the play, right? Which would be Jacobean England. Okay, the play was written after the death of Queen Elizabeth, so it's not specifically Elizabethan. It's actually Jacobean, just like Macbeth. I think it was written 1608. Shakespeare, remember, stopped writing plays in 1613, and then died on his birthday in 1616, April 23rd, 1616. So it's one of Shakespeare's later plays. It also exists now, right? So there's 3 time periods: Albion, Jacobean England, and now. Because, like with all great literature, I mean, in a figurative sense, in a metaphysical sense, great literature, the great literature in the canon lives. It continuously lives, right? But it also exists in a time where all of the things that are described in the play can exist now. And I think it's interesting because so what happens in the play, essentially, just a basic overview of the plot, is that the action begins right away. It in a sense, it's in media res, but not really. King Lear is an elderly king. He's at the zenith of his power. He walks into a room in his castle, and he essentially says, I've decided I'm going to give up my power, and I'm going to divide my kingdom into three parts. And this sort of reminds me of, Charlemagne, or even, Genghis Khan. You have these great rulers of old who divide their kingdom amongst their children. And I would say that, you could connect this to, for instance, any, let's say you have a sort of a patrician in the family, who decides to divide their fortune amongst their 3 children. And of course, what happens is the 3 children, as we continuously see, even now, the 3 children sort of fight over it. There's an unnumbered, there are innumerable dramas on television and in film where you have an older character who divides their wealth or their kingdom amongst their children, and they all fight for power, right? But it's interesting in this; it's slightly different. What happens is King Lear has 3 children. He has 3 girls: Cordelia, Goneril, and Regan. Of course, Shakespeare is potent with his naming, right? Cordelia is the youngest daughter, and Cordelia, in the etymology, essentially means heart. Cordelia is his heart. Goneril is supposed to remind you of, obviously, like gonorrhea. And Goneril and Regan are the 2 twisted, evil daughters. And he basically says, okay, to the 3 daughters, he says, tell me how much you love me, and I will give you, and I will allot you your third of the kingdom. Well, the first person he comes to is Cordelia. And Cordelia says, I'm not going to do that. And this is shocking to King Lear. What's the reason for this? Well, she says, I'm not going to flatter you. I'm simply going to say that I love you, and that should be enough. I love you no more and no less than you would expect me to love you as your faithful daughter. And in a sense, we should think, okay, that makes sense, right? And especially in contrast to the other 2. The other 2, of course, flatter him. And what Lear decides to do is he immediately, and this is the striking thing about the play, he immediately cuts off Cordelia. He says, I no longer want to see you. You're basically dead to me. Go whichever way you want. I don't care about you. And everyone else in the court, not the 2 other daughters, but everyone else in the court, they're shocked by this. They can't believe that he would cut off his daughter like this, including the King of France. So Cordelia decides to basically, she gets married. She goes off to France. Regan and Goneril both are married. And then we're introduced to a wide cast of characters. And one of the things about the play is that there are so many characters in the play, and there are so many, like, people vying for power, like these intricate, sort of dramatic, these sort of side dramas in the play, that it begins to confuse the reader. Now, Shakespeare did this on purpose, because one of the things that he's reflecting here is the fact that families and relationships are intricate, and you get lost in the vying for power. But another thing, which is particularly brilliant, is the fact that King Lear is old, and one of the themes in the play is madness. He after he gives up his kingdom, and he is he basically he goes off and he says, I'm going to live with my 100 knights. And it's basically, what this means is, like, he's a rich guy, he's got all this power, he divides his kingdom. Now he's going to retire, and he's going to hang out with his homeboys, he's going to hang out with his homies, just dudes being dudes. They're going to do whatever they want, they're going to go hunt, they're going to hang out. And so he decides to basically to, like, he goes and he stays at one of his daughter's houses. And then the house gets sort of overrun with all the fellas having too much fun, and unintentional rhyme there. And she says to him, look, you got to go, old man. And she kicks him out. And Lear is, upset by this, but he says, that's all right, I still got another daughter. So he goes off and he goes out and he hangs out with the other daughter. But when he gets there, she's like, no, you can't come here, you've already given up your power. And by the way, why do you need 100 knights? And then the other daughter shows up. So Cordelia's in France. This is Regan and Goneril. And the other daughter shows up, and she's like, and they're like, listen, you can hang out here as long as you divide your knights by 50. Now you can have 50 people in your retinue. Lear takes this as an affront to his power. And he says, no, man, I want 100. And then they say, why do you need 100? Why not 10 or 5? Why even 1? So what you see here is that his power and his friendships it's all being divided, and it's being reduced down to just him. Now, one of the brilliant things about this play, one of the things that people will immediately recognize about King Lear that they automatically think of, I mean, it's even on the cover of this Folger edition. You have King Lear here, and who's he hanging out with? There is a fool. He's hanging out with his jester, his fool. And Shakespeare obviously makes brilliant use throughout his oeuvre of the fool, right? We have the young Hal, the young Henry V, right, with Falstaff. We have Malvolio. We have a number of different fools. And of course, this sort of becomes a trope in Shakespeare, but he does it brilliantly, because what it signifies is essentially the shadow self. We have the man, and then we have the shadow self. And the fool, of course, on the surface, we have the difference between literal and figurative meaning, or we have the surface and we have the subtext. We've got the surface meaning, which everybody in the play sees. They see King Lear, and they see him hanging out with his fool. And they get continuously mad at the fool for speaking the truth. But what we see as readers is the giant iceberg of meaning beneath the surface, right? And what this means is essentially that Lear and the fool switch roles. They not only figuratively switch roles, but they literally switch roles, where King Lear becomes the fool. He takes on the jester's hat, and he wanders out into the wilderness with his fool. And the fool, the jester, the clown, is so much more profound than King Lear is. He speaks what King Lear cannot. In fact, he literally speaks what King Lear cannot in this play, because they wander. What happens is, after the two daughters get mad at him, he wanders out onto the moors, onto the heath, into this blasted storm. It's one of the most famous storms in all of literature. And of course, the outer storm is supposed to be a symbol of the mental storm, or the inner storm in Lear's mind. He is raging. He's raging at the dying of the light, essentially, in Dylan Thomas terms. We've covered Dylan Thomas here, of course. And he goes out onto this heath, and the storms, the thunder, and the clouds are supposed to represent the cloudiness of his mind. And he goes mad. He goes insane. It's interesting that the fool disappears until he's only mentioned in the final act of the play, in the final scene, the final act of the play, where King Lear says, oh, my poor fool, they've hanged my fool. Of course, this being a tragedy, everyone, pretty much everyone dies in the play. And I'll speak again in a second to what constitutes a Shakespearean tragedy. But what happens is, one of the things I was going to say was, one of the brilliant aspects of the play is the fact that King Lear is this old man, and he's suffering from this sort of dementia. And one of the reasons that we have the the storms, and we have the number of people who kind of go in and out of the play, and the reader kind of gets lost in terms of the characterization, is because it mirrors the cloudiness of Lear's mind. He's unable to decipher who is whom within the bounds of the play, who is friend, who's foe, who's his family. And so it's very difficult. And one of the things that ends up happening is we have one of the purest villains in all of Shakespeare. Harold Bloom called him essentially he's an embodiment of the Machiavellian, or the so-called new man, and that would be Edmund. Edmund is one of the most sinister, awful villains within the play, and his only raison d'etre, his only reason for being a villain, essentially, is that he's a bastard. He kind of it's kind of there's a little bit of intertextuality, because you'll recall in our Richard III stream that remember to smile and be a villain. There's a continuous theme in Shakespeare, which is true of life, right? Where you have the villains are the ones where, like in Julius Caesar, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. They always exist, like Lady Macbeth says, as the flower, but be the serpent under it. In other words, there's daggers in men's smiles, right? It's always the people who come to you with gifts and smiles and give you your kiss, right, that end up being the villains. And King Lear, kind of plays on that again. But one interesting thing is that Edmund attempts to he attempts to have redemption. He attempts to redeem himself at the end of the play by revealing that he has ordered the death of Cordelia. And so they go in and they find, because what happens is King Lear finds he's gone mad. He's finally rescued by his retinue. He's brought back to the castle. His friends all suffer all these horrible things. There's an Oedipal element in the play where Gloucester, who is the father of Edmund, gets his eyes gouged out by one of the other characters, and he's wandering around blind. Of course, the blindness of Gloucester is supposed to mirror the blindness of Lear, where Lear is not literally blind, but he is figuratively blind. And his figurative blindness is worse than the literal blindness that Gloucester suffers within the play, which is incredible. It's an incredible turn. Shakespeare he's incredible because he's able to fit so much. He packs so much into the course of events of one play. I mean, it's really incredible. And the fact that it mirrors, or it brings out so much of what's true about human life and human relationships. This is why Harold Bloom called, Shakespeare it's essentially the invention of the human. Shakespeare is able to cover the entire range of human emotions and human motivations. And Lear gets rescued by, of course, who's the person to rescue Lear? Cordelia, the daughter that he spurned at the beginning of the play. She loves him. She takes him in. Then she is captured by the forces of Edmund. And of course, because it's a tragedy, she is executed just a moment too soon. They go and they're going to rescue her from execution. And this is what separates Shakespearean tragedies from comedies, because as we've mentioned before many times here, the line between a tragedy and a comedy is very thin. There's a very thin line. In fact, the Shakespearean comedies have the potential to be far worse tragedies than the tragedies are. Oftentimes you have people faking their death, wearing masks, coming back in disguise. That occurs in King Lear. And of course, figuratively, that's supposed to represent the masks that people wear, right, in terms of their persona meaning mask. The play is amazing because, yes, it is depressing. It is, but it's not only depressing, it's depressing in a soul-crushing way where it is immensely depressing. That's why Shakespeare has Lear wander out of his castle, out of the normal circumstances of the Shakespearean theater, right? Usually everything takes place. Let's say the play is meant to be performed. So if you are producing the play and you're putting it on at the Globe Theater, you see all the events on stage, and usually things are inside. When you have battles, major set pieces in Shakespearean drama, for instance, in Henry V, you'll often have them out. The major events and the violence will take place off stage. However, one of the things about this is that he takes it outside, right? And it's really crazy, because you wonder how they were able to produce this outside. I mean, The Tempest does that, but even in The Tempest, the outside, right, is supposed to be, the outside is in a sense inside. It's inside the sort of Elizabethan John Dee metaphysical room, like universe of the world, right? In this one, everything takes place out, like purely outside in the storm. There's no inside, and that's to show that King Lear has gone out into the wilderness. He has no inside. And what Rachel says, she said, "Am I supposed to call BLA when I meet him? Is you call me what you call me based? Call me BLA. Call me blah blah blah. Yeah, you can call me my real name. Call me my real name, Rach." So anyway, shouts out to everybody in the chat. Really appreciate you all being here. Thanks for being here. Thanks for checking out our stream last night, right, at the Crucible, right? Shouts out to Andy and to Rachel, Based Homeschool Mom, our friends over there. And Andy had Jerry, Exposing Powerful Lies, my homeboy over there, had us on the stream there last night. And Jerry just restreamed it. So please make sure you go over to his channel, Exposing Powerful Lies live streams, and check him out. That was really fun. It was deep. It was dark. And as I said the other day, yes, I've been a lot of the material that we cover, guys, and a lot of literature tends to be dark. And there's not much I can do about that. But, this is the reason that we do this, is because this is reflective of life, right? Look at the world we live in. I mean, it's as I've said before, one reason that you cover literature is because sometimes you see things more truthfully in terms of their periphery, if that makes sense. It's like the metaphor of, staring at the moon and your eyes kind of go blurry because it's so big. You can't make out the little, the little craters on the moon, because the light reflected off the moon tends to blur. And so if you kind of avert your eyes for a second, you're able to focus. Well, that's kind of what literature does for us, right? And I know I'm making a pretty kind of a simplistic statement there, but we're reading something that was written, 400 years ago, and it applies more to today. It gives us more insight and more truth into today than, I don't know, anything written now, right? Shouts out to everybody. Please make sure that you like the stream, share it, hit that subscribe button if you haven't. I really appreciate y'all. And please, you guys, help me get up to that 1,000 the 1,000 subs. And also you can donate to the Based Fund, because Lars is trying to Napster me, you guys. No, look, that was a joke that our friend Jath posted on Instagram. All right. Because of my Metallica stream the other day. But seriously, you can donate to the Based Lit Analyzer Fund that my wonderful, beautiful mods are dropping throughout. And that is in the video description and in the channel description, at Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App. Why am I getting a low signal here? I should not be getting a low signal because I got perfect internet. So I don't know why I'm dropping in and out, but let's keep it going. Maybe I should turn that off. Okay, there we go. All right. So let's get back into King Lear. And, and speaking of that, I want to see everybody this weekend at the JD event in Nashville. And if you can't make it, then, well, I'm sorry. You won't be there for SummerSlam, JD, Dire Stock. It's going to be a awesome event. It's going to be a lot of fun. But again, Yes, you can support me at Venmo, Cash App, and PayPal. Any of the links in the channel description, the video description. And please support me and help me get that gas money and help me get that, help me be able to make it all the way to Nashville and back. And I appreciate y'all. Shouts out to Thomas Henderson and everybody out there. Okay, so yes, one of the things, let's talk about what constitutes a tragedy. Okay. There are a couple of elements in Shakespeare that will make a tragedy. Now, as we've discussed before in Macbeth and Hamlet, the word tragedy, you guys, is we've got, okay, when we talk about denotation and connotation, right? The denotation, etymology in English is interesting because words can take on completely different meanings from their original meaning, and that's fine. That doesn't make the new meaning any less meaningful, if that makes sense. However, denotation means the dictionary definition, what a word means originally according to its etymology. The connotation means the perceived meaning or what a word has come to mean. Tragedy is an interesting word because it's an overused word. It's a word that's thrown around for things that are not classically tragic. Okay, so what constitutes a tragedy in terms of Shakespeare? Well, a few things. First of all, you have to have a tragic hero. Usually the tragic hero is the title character, right? So that would be Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. There are 4 Shakespearean tragedies. Remember that when people refer to the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet is not actually, even in terms of Shakespeare, a tragedy. Just to recap, why is Romeo and Juliet, especially if you're new here, and that's cool. I love talking about this, but why is Romeo and Juliet not a tragedy? Well, because for one, the characters are united in their death. They are together. They are happy in their death together. 2, remember, 2 houses, both alike in dignity, right? From civil blood makes civil hands unclean. They will become friends at the end of the play. They will cease their civil strife. So the Montague and the Capulet house will come together in the end of the play. That means it's not a tragedy. The other important thing is that the dramatic irony in that play shows us, right? We know from the very first, from the sonnet that opens up Romeo and Juliet, that it is not a tragedy. Why? Because we know from the very beginning that Romeo and Juliet are going to die. A pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. We know that from the very beginning. It cannot be a tragedy. So Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, and Macbeth are tragedies because you may know that the characters are going to die. You may know through cultural influence, through the osmosis, through a general understanding of literature and culture that Hamlet's going to die. You may know that, right? Good night, sweet prince. But in terms of the language of the text itself from the very beginning of the play, you don't know that Hamlet's going to die. We don't know that. We don't know reading King Lear that King Lear is going to die. We don't know that Macbeth is going to die. We don't know that Othello is going to die. But what makes them a tragedy is that these are the title characters and they're going to die. Another element is that in a Shakespearean tragedy is that the tragic hero has to fall from a high place to a low place. They have to be an important character, a king or an emperor. They have to be, or in Othello's case, a general. They have to be somebody who is socially bigger than the rest of the characters, and not just bigger in the sense that, they're not a pleb or they're not a peasant in the life of, the Shakespearean social strata. They have to be larger than life, and they must fall to a low place. And the low place is only defined according to death or exile. That is what makes a Shakespearean tragedy. One of the most famous tragedies of all time, which would be Oedipus Rex, which we've actually covered, is an example of where the tragic hero does not fall into death. He actually falls into exile. Remember that Oedipus Rex goes into exile at the end of the play. It's interesting that King Lear has a number of Oedipal influences within King Lear, specifically the character of Gloucester, like I mentioned, who is blinded. His eyes are gouged out through over the course of events of the play. But also there is a strange sort of Oedipal relationship between Lear and his daughters. A number of times he kisses them in a strange way. And we have to wonder reading this play, why his daughters are the way that they are. Cordelia, we can figure that, she has a virtue. Why is she the way she is? But it's interesting that he has these twin sort of Gemini daughters, Goneril and Regan, who are awful. They are snakes. And we have to wonder, why did they come out this way? What has Lear done? Well, again, my thesis statement would say that this is the worst family in the world. And I would venture to say that Lear is a tragic hero, but he is not one without faults. I mean, the tragic hero has to have faults. In fact, another definition of a tragic hero is that he must have a tragic flaw. So scholars can kind of, I don't know, they can sort of try and decipher a number of different tragic flaws for each of these characters. I mean, I would sort of postulate that Hamlet's tragic flaw is, at least I would originally, would be his indecision, right? His indecisiveness. I would probably change that now, but that's another story. Macbeth, I would say that Macbeth's tragic flaw is probably his megalomania. Othello's tragic flaw is obviously his jealousy. That one's pretty clear cut. But what is King Lear's tragic flaw? I guess we'll see as we go on here. But I would think that one of Lear's probably his central tragic flaw, right, would be either his hubris or his, I don't know how you would define this, but his inability to let go. That's one of the major themes in the play. Remember that the whole purpose is, if you're a king and you have everything and you're going to divide your kingdom up into thirds and you're going to hand it over, well, you have to hand it over. You got to let it go. It's got to go. But he tries to hold on to his power by proxy through the rest of the play. And that's one of the things that drives him mad. His inability to control everything in his life, his relationships with his children, his relationships with his family, his inability to listen to his closest advisors who love him, right? There are people in this play who love him, and all they do is give. They give of themselves completely to him. One of them is Kent. One of his closest advisors, Kent, is banished from the kingdom and then decides to come back in disguise, and he sticks with King Lear no matter what. He even walks out onto the heath with him in all of his madness. The fool, right? The fool's job is to stay with him, but the fool sort of also, obviously, as we said, represents this sort of metaphysical or almost Gnostic shadow self of King Lear. But the fool, nevertheless, sticks with King Lear, and he sort of, all he does is give, whereas King Lear seems to just take. We've talked about this theme recently a lot in literature. He just takes. He takes. And it's not until the end of the play where he sort of learns his lesson, so to speak, right, with Cordelia, although it's too late, that he can't take anymore. He has to give his heart. And, of course, his heart is literally Cordelia. Cordelia meaning heart. Again, I would reiterate with all great literature, as we always do, that there's not a moral lesson to be gleaned from this, in the sense that it's not a fable, right? It's not didactic. We are supposed to read, we're supposed to take our moral worldview and apply it to the play. We're supposed to understand the worldview within the play and understand what the system of morals and ethics is, and where it goes wrong, where it goes right. But we're not supposed to take away a sort of a didactic lesson from the play. In fact, Harold Bloom stated that with King Lear, there is no lesson in the play. It's not nihilistic. It's not quite nihilistic, but it is depressing, in the sense that depressing is not an accurate word for the play. It can't possibly, the word depression or depressing can't possibly apply to a play that is this immense. It is beyond depression. It is beyond oppression. It is something almost cosmic in its scope. And that's why the language of the play is cosmic. Much of the language deals with cosmos, right, with cosmology, with the pantheon of the gods within the worldview, within the purview of the play. But it is huge in every way. King Lear is a huge play. It is massive. It is immense. In fact, just to be honest, I mean, it's pretty daunting reading this play. Macbeth is an easy play for me to read because number one, it's my favorite. It's one of my favorite works of literature of all time. It's clearly my favorite Shakespearean work. It's easy for me to read. It's accessible. Macbeth is also the shortest of Shakespeare's plays, right? Whereas we just covered Antony and Cleopatra, the longest of Shakespeare's plays. And is it the longest or the second longest? It's one of his longest. I think it's his longest. It has the most words. And King Lear is certainly up there. It's one of his longest plays. It's huge. It's an immense play. All Shakespearean plays, though, are divided, remember, into 5 acts. Of course, Shakespeare himself did not divide them that way. They were divided that way by scholars over the course of time and according to the First Folio. The First Folio was published in 1623, which was about 7 years after Shakespeare's death. Again, I'll reiterate, just to kind of as a rebuttal against people who say that Shakespeare didn't write his own plays. Yes, this play does contain kind of a dialectic between 2 modes of thought, one of which is the sort of Francis Bacon mode of thought. However, the language is purely Shakespearean and it contains the Shakespearean voice. And the rebuttal would be that, remember, people will say, oh, Shakespeare was this poor country guy who wrote his name like 77 different ways. Well, actually, there's not a single extant version of Shakespeare writing his name, right? All of the extant versions of Shakespeare in print are from later printers. They're from later printers. They're from people who put together the First Folio and who printed his works. His plays were performed. At the time. They are noted at the time contemporaneously. Shakespeare was not Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was Francis Bacon. Shakespeare was a real guy. And look, that's not to say that I haven't looked into it or that I'm denying this like just on the surface or, oh, that's silly. No, of course we need to look into these things, right? And of course we need to look at the motivations and why these things, why people say these things. But I think that it's important to have discernment and to see the real from the false, and the fact that that he did exist, that he did write it. There's plenty of evidence that he did. There's no evidence that he didn't, besides later speculation. And I don't know if someone can come up with some, convincing evidence that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare and he was written by a committee or by other people or by Edward de Vere or, the Earl of Oxford or Christopher Marlowe, then I'll look at that a little bit more. But I've looked into all this stuff, right? Yeah, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, seems to be a legitimate theory to Shakespeare's identity, except for that Edward de Vere was also a writer and did not have the same voice as Shakespeare, right? However, it's interesting looking into that. Okay, so let's talk about I'm going to read some introduction from a scholar dealing with King Lear at the beginning. Then we're going to dive into the text. This says, so great is the suffering depicted in Shakespeare's King Lear that one has trouble finding the words to write about it. It is a play that relentlessly challenges its readers and theater audiences with the magnitude, intensity, and sheer duration of the pain that it represents. Remember, one of the things that's interesting is that Shakespeare had 3 children, just like King Lear did, right? Hamnet, Judith, and then he had a living daughter who was much older, who married a lawyer. There's no living descendants of Shakespeare, right? It says, it is a play that relentlessly challenges its readers with the magnitude, intensity, and sheer duration of the pain that it represents. While other tragedies, including many of Shakespeare's, depict their characters experiencing a measure of joy and satisfaction before the onset of their misery, King Lear offers us no such relief. From the beginning to end, all of its figures suffer, and all attempt various strategies to escape their suffering, some hardening their hearts, others engaging in orgies of violence, many devoting themselves to alleviating the suffering of others. Lear himself raging against his own pain until his sanity cracks. In this play, only death seems to provide escape from the rack of this tough world. Also says, this double story draws us because it tells us about families, about fathers and daughters, and sons, sisters and their husbands and lovers, brothers, natural and unnatural. In this play, ordinary jealousies, demands for love, sibling rivalries, desire for money and power, petty cruelties are all taken to the extreme, literally in extremis, right? Death. We can see ourselves and our small vices magnified to gigantic proportions. Also in this play, we can see the end of our lives with old age portrayed in all its vulnerability, helplessness, pride, and finally, perhaps wisdom. Lear had envisioned a world in which old men would continue to be respected, even after giving away their money and their power. A world in which everyone would behave as Kent does, continuing to admire and obey because of the authority that inheres in Lear himself. Lear learns that once time and age have weakened one, without money and power, one is almost helpless against the ravages of greed and power hunger. But his final speech to Cordelia suggests that he also learns that finally, greed and power hunger do not really matter. Lear moves out of the world of the young and the middle-aged and into an old age world of letting go. The play's special understanding of old age explains in part why this most devastating of Shakespeare's tragedies is also perhaps his most moving. So again, it's rare to see a good Lear production, and it's rare to see, well, it's rare to see a Lear production at all. One of the most famous recent productions was with Christopher Plummer. You remember the great actor Christopher Plummer, who died pretty recently. He was sort of a mid-Atlantic actor. He was actually Canadian, but people mistake him for being English. They mistake him for being German, for being American. He was the dad in The Sound of Music in 1963, 64, I think was Sound of Music, Best Picture, 64. And then he was the actor who, not too long ago took the place of Creeper Spacey in All the Money in the World, the Ridley Scott film about the Gettys. Right. Remember when all the stuff came out about Creeper Kevin Spacey, and they had to get a replacement, so they got Christopher Plummer. He was still around. And Christopher Plummer played King Lear in a production I think it was in D.C., that was one of the monumental productions of King Lear. Great actor. I love Christopher Plummer. Remember, he was in shouts out to Jeff. He was also in 12 Monkeys. He's in a lot of stuff. He had a kind of a revival towards the end there. Right. Maddie says he was Nick Cage's granddad in National Treasure. Was he? Yeah, he was. I'm thinking of John Voight because John Voight was his dad in that, right? This says, let's see, Shakespeare's words. It says, some words are strange, not because of the static introduced by changes in language over the past centuries, but because these are words that Shakespeare is using to build his dramatic world that has its own space, time, history, and background mythology. King Lear is a particularly interesting example of this practice in this play. Shakespeare creates two worlds separated by centuries of time, but that seem to exist simultaneously. One of these worlds is that of the Britain inhabited by the legendary King Lear, who in the histories of Shakespeare's time came to power in the year of the world 3105, i.e. in 845 BC, many years before the founding of Rome. I'm so glad that this particular book uses BC and not the fake and gray BCE, right? This world is created through the references to the mysteries of Hecate, to Scythians and other barbaric peoples who make their generations messes, i.e. eat their own young, to Apollo and Jupiter, both of whom play important roles in the stories of early Britain. This world is recalled throughout the play in references to Sarum Plain, prehistoric name for Salisbury Plain, and Camelot, in repeated references to the gods, and in dialogue about astrology, reportedly of wide influence in the early days of Britain, including such terms as sectary astronomical, the operations of the orbs, and under the dragon's tail. One of the great themes in this is the dragon. It's used in terms of astrology, the constellation of the dragon, but also a few of King Lear's famous sayings in the play, which would be, come not between the dragon and his wrath. And another, how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. In other words, he sees himself as this sort of devouring dragon, right? And do not come between the dragon and what he intends to do. However, that's a contradiction. That's one of the great contrasts in the play, in that it creates the tension, because the dragon wants to retire right into the Tolkien hovel and sit, on his gold hoard, right? But he's unable to. Maybe I misspoke. The constellation. Is there a constellation of the dragon? Is there one? It's not Draco, is it? I don't know. Maybe I've lost my mind there. But there are definitely repeated references to the dragon throughout, in terms of astrology and cosmology. And it's interesting that it talks about Sarum Plain. Sarum Plain, if I'm sure you guys know this, but Sarum Plain and Salisbury Plain are sort of the ancient southeastern English regions in England, where notably Stonehenge resides. Now, I was just talking about this with Rachel, based homeschool mom. We were talking about Druids and Stonehenge, and I think probably most Americans don't realize that Stonehenge, the way that it looks now, is not actually it's not actually Stonehenge. I mean, there is I guess an archaeological formation underground at Stonehenge, and the boulders are real. They do exist. However, Stonehenge did not always exist like that. You remember that scene in National Lampoon's European Vacation where they drive up to Stonehenge and he drives into it and knocks it over like dominoes and they fall over? Well, the reason that was funny at the time is because it was built up in the 50s and the 50s and the 60s. They started working on it in the 20s, where it was just a mass of Neolithic boulders. Stonehenge, for most of known human history, existed more like, it looked more like the Giant's Ring in Northern Ireland, which is like, there's a depression in the ground, and you can see that there was a complex there, but they didn't have these pristine stones standing up in a sort of a solar formation. They used cranes and put those up that way. This says, at the same time, the early scenes of the play create a court and a political world that linguistically reflects Shakespeare's own time. Now, this again is another vindication of Shakespeare being authentic, because there is no source of modern English greater than Shakespeare, right? Except for the King James Bible. The King James Bible, the AV, the authorized version, and Shakespeare give us our modern English. That's what does it. Shakespeare created more neologisms, which are unique to him, which don't exist in any other writer. And this play is no exception. It says, "This is a world of dukes, princes, kings. It is a world of courtly phrases, my services to your lordship. I must love you and sue to know you better. I shall study deserving and of formal courtly orders. To thine and Albany's issue be this perpetual." The two worlds of the play are linked through words that describe the land of Britain, quote, shadowy forests, wide-skirted meads, champaigns rich with plenteous rivers, words that could describe both ancient and 17th century Britain. It is possible that in part King Lear's seeming timelessness is a function of this double world created through the play's diction. One of the things that I learned through this introduction is, it says there's a continuous reference to, remember, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars but in ourselves, right? And one of the things that is continuously referenced in this play is the idea of fate. Of course, fate versus free will. And it's interesting that Edmund, the so-called new man, the Machiavellian man, is the one who in the play says, no, listen, it's not the stars that made, I'm paraphrasing here, but he essentially says, it's not the stars that made me do this. It's not fate that made me act this way, that made me a villain. It was myself. I was the villain. I chose to be this way, and I did it. Whereas King Lear continuously, especially when he's out on the heath and sort of is yelling at the blasted storm, he wants to, throw the terrible events of his life on his fate. He was fated to act this way, right? Shakespeare knew too much about the court system to be a commoner. Not true. No, Shakespeare performed for the court system And Shakespeare was a member of Lord Chamberlain's men. He was also a member, he was a stockholder in the King's Men, right? He was a major stockholder in the King's Men. They were funded by the king. Plays were continuously produced for the court. They were sponsored by the court. They had court patronage, and it was a sort of a wide known and symbiotic relationship. Not to mention the fact that, one did not have to be a wide reader to understand the goings on of the court at the time. One of the things that I learned here is it says, often the play's language contains metaphors that do not lie clearly on the surface of the play, but when discovered, make the character's speeches much more vivid. When Edmund says in the play's second scene, this is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surface of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, the stars. Just under the surface of his language is a metaphor in which bad luck is imaged as a sickness caused by our own surfeits, i.e. overindulgences. These lines also contain an amusing play on words. The word disasters, a word of astrological origin, meaning literally from the stars. Did you know that? The etymology of the word disaster is dis, right? Which we've covered in depth with the city of Dis when we talked about the etymology of the word dis and the idea of the not or inversion in Dante's Inferno. Right, in the fourth circle of hell, and also aster, as in astra, right? Ad astra per aspera. Disaster literally means it's from the stars. The opening scene, Lear's, "'Tis our fast intent to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths while we unburdened crawl toward death," carries within it a metaphor in which man is pictured as a pack animal that in its old age shakes off its heavy load. Later in the same scene within Lear's, "I do invest you jointly with my power, preeminence, and all the large effects that troop with majesty," in Act 1, Scene 1, line 146. The word troop metaphorically makes power and preeminence and other large effects into companions that march along with majesty. In this final example, we see not only a metaphor in which the attributes of kingship are likened to the king's traveling companions, we also see personification, a kind of figurative language used with unusual frequency and power in King Lear. In personification, abstract qualities or natural objects are given human characteristics so that power is allowed to troop. Kent uses personification when he says to Lear, "Thinkest thou that duty shall have dread to speak when power to flattery bows? To plainness honors bound when majesty falls to folly." One thing, just in terms of literary terminology, it's interesting that, the difference between personification and apostrophe. You may not know this. It's just a small point. But personification, right, is when you personify. When you personify an inanimate object. That's why, I think I've discussed this before, that's why animation is called animation, because you are animating something inanimate. In other words, there is an object, right? Let's say it's a drawing, right? You have a piece of paper and you're drawing a bunny, right? You're drawing a bunny rabbit on a piece of paper. But animation means that you are giving it an anima. You're giving it a soul. In other words, a figurative soul, because you are making it live and breathe and act sort of with human characteristics. That's why it's called animation. Personification is different from, has sort of various aspects, and one of those is actually called apostrophe. Apostrophe is where a person is speaking directly to an inanimate object. That's why Lord Byron writes his poem Apostrophe to the Ocean, because he's not necessarily just personifying the ocean like a person. He's speaking directly to it. So when you speak directly to an inanimate object, it's actually, in literary terminology, called an apostrophe. I'm going to skip real quick to what Harold Bloom says about Hamlet. Of course, we've talked about Harold Bloom in depth. I mean, Harold Bloom's interesting to talk about because Harold Bloom is straight up on the surface, no doubt. He says it himself. He is a Kabbalah Gnostic. That's what he is. He wrote Omens of the Millennium. He wrote, all of his chapters, even all of his classifications in this book, Genius, or in the Invention of the Human, or in the Western canon, are all classified according to stages in the Sephiroth, which I find, Yeah, I mean that right. Okay. That it is what it is, says the eternal boomer. However, I think that there's something to be said for listening to what Harold Bloom says, because remember that he gave us when we were talking about Moby Dick, he was the one who gave us the pretty insightful comment that Moby Dick is about the American religion, so to speak, is what he called it, which is this combination of sort of Pentecostalism and Zionism, right? Which is this sort of which he called it, a sort of a neo-Gnosticism and the American religion, right? And I think that's it's important because to listen to this, because of course, Harold Bloom, again, we don't have to agree with what Harold Bloom says, right? But I think it's important to listen to him in terms of what he says about Shakespeare and for a worldview that we can. I don't always agree with Harold Bloom, of course, and I'm not saying these are my ideas, but what I'm saying is let's listen to what he has to say here, and maybe we can glean some truth from it. He says in this book when he's talking about King Lear, he says, let's see. First, he's talking about Hamlet. So he says, the Hamlet of Act 5 controls our perspectives. We do not know more than he does, and he believes we know less. Because Hamlet, of course, is Shakespeare's sort of all-encompassing, by far his most intelligent character. Did Shakespeare know more than Hamlet did? In the Hegelian sense, Hamlet is the freest artist of himself and can tell us much more about what he represents if only there were time enough. Reminds me of T.S. Eliot, right? If there were time enough, indeed. And of course, there will be time for the taking of toast and tea, says T.S. Eliot. I interpret that to mean that Hamlet is the supreme artist of self-overhearing, and so could teach us at least the rudiments of that disconcerting art. To hear yourself, at least for an instant, without self-recognition is to open your spirit to the tempests of change. Shakespeare found this opening most largely with Hamlet and with Falstaff, but it is a constant of all his later work. I illustrate it now as fully as I can with the dying Edmund in King Lear, because his final change seems to me the most drastically persuasive in all of Shakespeare. No one in Shakespeare is so free of emotion as Edmund, bastard son of the Earl of Gloucester and half-brother to Edgar. And Edmund and Edgar are half-brothers in the play. What happens is, in one of the sort of the side plots that drives the main plot forward, Edmund forges a letter that essentially says that Edgar is going to do a coup d'etat and he's going to take over the government. And he does this because he's the bastard son. He knows he'll never get anything. Edgar then goes wild into the wilderness, and it's up for interpretation whether he himself goes mad. He sort of takes on another identity, which is what does he call himself? Tom of Bedlam. Poor Tom. And he sort of goes into the woods, covers his face in mud, and goes wild. However, later in the play, he says that this was play acting and that he did this to escape and to get away. But it's interesting because it's just another mirror. It's like another shadow self of King Lear within the bounds of the play. But what ends up happening is Edgar returns, throws down the gauntlet, challenges Edmund to a duel, and kills him. But Edmund's final act in the play is, like Harold Bloom is talking about here, a change. It's an immense change that no other character sort of undergoes in much of Shakespeare. It says, let's see, Lear's to Edgar, Lear's godson, Iago takes a certain antic glee in his own beautiful wickedness. Iago, of course, is the villain in Othello, and one of the, like we said before, one of the most wicked characters in all of Shakespeare. Of course, Iago is the character, one of the two characters that all actors wish to play, especially in the Shakespearean canon. All actors want to play Hamlet and Iago. They're two sort of dialectical opposites in terms of characterization. But Iago is a delicious character to play because he's so evil. It says, but Edmund is beyond that. The Dostoevskian nihilists, let's see. Dostoevsky and nihilists have learned some lessons from Edmund, but cannot equal his sublime coldness. Of course, we've covered Dostoevsky here. And at Primal Edge Health, shouts out to Tristan, Primal Edge Health. As the lover of both Goneril and Regan, rival monsters of the deep, both beastly characters, almost Crowleyan beast characters. And as the betrayer of both his father and his brother, Edmund surpasses himself when he orders the secret execution of Lear and Cordelia. Remorse, pity, affection, even honest lust have no place in Edmund's nature. He lies dying upon the ground, having received his death wound from Edgar, and he is strangely accepting once he knows that his slayer is at least his equal in lineage. The wheel is come full circle. I am here. Somewhat moved to Edgar's account of their father's death, Edmund is almost ready for change, which comes decisively by way of an extraordinary self-overhearing. The bodies of Goneril and Regan are carried onto the stage, and Edmund puzzles it out. His quote is, "Yet Edmund was beloved, the one, the other poisoned for my sake, and after slew herself. So startled is he by his own, yet Edmund was beloved, that Gloucester's bastard son can believe what he hears only by adding the painfully obvious, the one, the other poisoned for my sake, and after slew herself. Self-overhearing is anything but a metaphor in this hearing, with only half awareness and little intentionality. There are no moments like this in Homer or the Bible, Virgil, or Dante. This is a new inwardness that creates rather than confronts change. Belatedly, despite of my own nature, Edmund attempts to save Cordelia and Lear from his own murderousness. For Cordelia, it is too late, and Lear, insane again, will enter with her corpse in his arms. Shakespeare has perfected self-overhearing into a mode that will be crucial in Chekhov and Stendhal, Dostoevsky and Proust, and many more. If to invent the ever-augmenting inner spirit, including its faculty for self-overhearing, is not the invention of the human as we since have known the human, then perhaps we are too overwhelmed by social history and by ideologies to recognize our indebtedness to William Shakespeare. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all that. However, I think it is quite a pretty beautiful insight into the character, at the very least, of Edmund, the bastard Edmund. Okay, so before I dive into some excerpts from the text, and talking about form and content, please, you guys, make sure that you donate to the Based Nashville Dyer's Eve Fund, right? Which is Cash App, Venmo, PayPal. Yes, please help me to get to Nashville, and also, of course, those guys are trying to get me, especially Lars, for my Metallica stream, right? So please donate to my Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, and help me to get to Nashville this weekend, where I hope to see each and every one of you. I would really appreciate it. Okay, so let's go. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Jethro, for dropping those links. Okay. Let's go here. Let's start off with what happens in the. I'm going to skip to. Let's see. This is Act 1. Yeah, this is Act 1, Scene 1, about lines about 97. Lear says, "To thee and thine heredity ever remain this ample third of our fair kingdom, no less in space, validity, and pleasure than that conferred on Goneril." He's talking to Regan. "Now our joy, although our last and least, to whose young love the vines of France and milk of Burgundy strive to be interested. What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak." Cordelia says, "Nothing, my lord." Lear says, "Nothing?" Cordelia says, "Nothing." Lear says, "Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again." Cordelia says, "Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart in my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond. No more, no less." How, Cordelia? "Mend your speech a little, lest you may mar your fortunes." In other words, listen, you need to temper what you're saying, Cordelia, because you may not get a fortune if you don't flatter me. She says, good, my lord. You have begot me, bred me, loved me. I returned those duties back as a right fit. Obey you, love you, and most honor you. Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all? Haply, when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him. Half my care and duty, sure, I shall never marry like my sisters to love my father all. This is an interesting point here. Okay, this is kind of a, now listen, Cordelia here is kind of sparking out, okay, a little bit, but she's also kind of having a Hamlet moment. And what does she mean by this? Well, Lear is saying, Cordelia, tell me that you love me. Tell me that you love me with all your heart. And Cordelia is taking this literally. And do you understand her plight here? If she is to be truly virtuous and to truly, if she's going to tell the truth, then she's going to tell the truth. And what she says here is, listen, I love you, Dad, King Lear, but not with all my heart. Okay. I love you with the fullness of my heart now. But one example of the fact that I won't love you with my whole heart is seen with my two sisters, right? And what she says is, look, if Regan and Goneril, right, love you with their whole heart, then how are they married? That's a pretty good point. Now, look, you could take this and you could go, okay, I get what you mean. And that's kind of what King Lear does. He's kind of like, okay, I meant it figuratively. But what he's doing here is he's putting their love to the test for monetary value. And of course, Regan and Goneril are like totally in on this. They totally love this. But Cordelia sees through it and she says, look, I can't love you with my whole heart because what if I get married? Right? If I get married to the King of France, well, he's going to take at least half of my heart because if I love him, then how could I marry you, right? How could I marry him? And King Lear says, but goes thy heart with this? Cordelia says, I, my good lord, so young and so untender, so young, my lord, and true. In other words, he's saying, are you so young and this is pretty harsh. And she says, no, I'm young, but I know the truth. Lear says, let it be so. Thy truth then be thy dower. For by the sacred radiance of the sun, the mysteries of Hecate and the night, by all the operation of the orbs, from whom we do exist and cease to be, here I disclaim all my paternal care, propinquity and property of blood, and as a stranger to my heart and me, hold thee from this forever. The barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighbored, pitied, and relieved as thou, my sometime daughter. Yeah, he's manipulating her. He is totally manipulating her. And you have to wonder, is this because of his pride? Is this because he sees himself in the pantheon of the gods to which he says that he owes his life and his favor? One interesting thing that we haven't covered at all here is the occult element in this. And Edmund and Edgar, as sort of two opposite sides of a Gemini twin coin, which Goneril and Regan sort of represent in terms of their closeness, is the fact that what Edmund and Edgar both bring out is that whenever they discuss madness or their reasons for doing anything, or their motivations, especially in terms of madness or their ill deeds, they continuously bring up devils. They bring up the fact that they have been possessed or they have been overtaken by devils. And Edmund is clearly shown to be a devil in this play. Smoking a pancake, bong in a blind, cigarette a waffle. He says, let's see. Kent says, good, my liege. Kent is his advisor. And Kent, remember, is the character who he's a friend of Lear. And Lear has basically just said, tell me how much you love me. Tell me you love me with your whole heart. Cordelia says, well, I can't love you with my whole heart, right? For one, when I was a child, I loved childish things. And when I became a man, when she grew up, she put away childish things, right? And she's no longer going to love her dad like she's going to love her husband. Her husband's going to come first. Yes. And Lear says, get out of my sight. You're no longer my daughter. I hate you. You're my sometime daughter. I never want to see you again. He obviously, this to me is like one of the aspects of the motivations of play where like he's this old man and he's giving up his power before he goes fully demented. And he says, basically, get out of here, right? Kent, his friend and his advisor, says, whoa, dude, hold on a second. Okay, chill. And then Lear says to him, come not between the dragon and his wrath. Now, it's interesting that he brings that up because what's the extension of that metaphor? Well, the dragon and his wrath, obviously we are, to bring to mind Revelation. We're to bring to mind that King Lear is identifying himself with this sort of dragon or with almost a satanic fury. But also, if he's the dragon and he's going to retire and he's going to sit on his gold hoard, the thing that he cares about the most is his physical wealth. Now, by giving up his physical wealth and dividing it, he's actually still manipulating them into keeping his physical wealth. So he sees his daughters as kinds of possessions. Cordelia, right, as his heart essentially says, I'm not a possession, right? I'm a free agent. And Lear says, basically he says, I loved her most and thought to set my rest on her kind nursery. So he thinks of her again as a child, but also as the nursery is a pun here because it's almost like a garden. It's like in Macbeth when he says, what does Macbeth say? He says, I will plant thee, and we want to plant thee and see thee grow. Everybody in the kingdom, there's a continuous element of metaphor especially in the royal court of like all of the various people, all of the various agents are sort of like plants in the nursery of the royal court where they will plant them and they will see them grow up into trees to sort of create this forest. In Macbeth, obviously, the irony is that the forest is the forest of Dunsinane that will come back to haunt him. He says, hence and avoid my sight to Cordelia. So be my grave, my peace, as here I give her father's heart from her. Call France, who stirs? He says, Cornwall and Albany, with my two daughters' dowers, digest the third. Let pride, which she calls plainness, marry her. It's interesting that he is saying, yes, love cannot be bought. And Cordelia is aware, and the vindication of that is that in the play, Lear ends up with, of course, Cordelia because he's buying his love from his daughters, who, of course, are going to sell it, to sell their manhoods cheap, right? As Henry V says, sell their manhoods cheap. They're going to sell their faith and their loyalty cheaply. And what do they end up doing? They end up turning on each other like serpents and killing each other, poisoning each other. And we see that Cordelia was right all along. And he says, it's interesting that he accuses her of the sin of pride when he himself is the proud one. He is the one who's sort of infected with this sin of pride, right? It says, let pride, which she calls plainness, marry her. I do invest you jointly with my power, preeminence, and all the large effects that troop with majesty. Ourself, my monthly course, with reservation of 100 nights, by you to be sustained, shall our abode make with you by due turn. Only we shall retain the name and all the addition to a king, the sway, revenue, execution of the rest. Beloved sons, be yours, which to confirm this coronet part between you. In other words, he takes her third and he divides it between Albany and is it Albany and Kent? Who was it? It was between Cornwall and Albany. And by the way, Albany is the husband of, I can't remember who it is, Regan or Goneril. He ends up being a good guy and being like, oh, my wife is insane. She's crazy. And look at what she's doing. Cornwall is the guy who gouges out the eyes of Gloucester. Kent says, Royal Lear, whom I have ever honored as my king, loved as my father, as my master, followed, my great patron, thought on in my prayers. Lear says, the bow is bent and drawn, make from the shaft. Yeah, his issue is which is a pun in Shakespeare. The issue is also meant to mean like the children. But his issue in this is essentially that whatever he says goes. He's going to divide his kingdom, but he's going to be king only in name. He's going to have his friends, but he still wants control. And whatever he says goes. That reminds me of in Julius Caesar, right? Remember in Julius Caesar when the senators come to him the morning of the assassination and they say to him, can you let, it's not Casca. They want to let one of the guys back from exiles that Caesar had exiled. And this is sort of their ploy to get him to look at the paper, which when he denies it, then they use that as the impetus to assassinate him. And Caesar says, doth Brutus bootless kneel? He says, I am constant as the northern star, whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament, so in the world. In other words, when Caesar makes a decision, it will stay forever no matter what. Lear makes the same decision. He is unbending. Look at the irony. He's unbending, but he says the bow is bent, right? He says, Kent says, reserve thy state, and in thy best consideration check this hideous rashness. Answer my life, my judgment. The youngest daughter does not love thee least, nor are those empty-hearted whose low sounds reverb no hollowness. Insightful. Nor are those empty-hearted whose low sounds reverb no hollowness. Lear says, Kent, on thy life no more. Kent says, my life I never held, but as a pawn to wage against thine enemies, nor fear to lose it, thy safety being motive. Lear says, out of my sight. And Kent says, see better, Lear, and let me still remain the true blank of thine eye. In other words, my whole life has been about service to you, and you have to listen to me, right? Listen to me because I'm trying to speak sense to you. Lear basically banishes him, says, get out of my sight. But it's interesting, this idea of sight. Of course, Shakespeare does this thing that he always does in his dramas where this is foreshadowing, right? The idea of sight is sort of almost stolen directly in terms of its diction, how it occurs in Oedipus Rex. We constantly have the verbs to see. We have the actions of sight, seeing, vision, which are meant to play a contrast with the fact that somebody in this is going to go blind. And in Oedipus, it's a little bit more blatant because we have Tiresias. Tiresias is the blind seer, right, with that oxymoron. I mean, he is unable to see physically, but he can sort of see the truth, right? He can sort of see people's motivations. In this, they all can see, and Gloucester can see, but Gloucester will go blind. But it's only in his blindness that he will be able to see what is really happening to Lear and about all the machinations of the various youth. Skip to later on in Act 1, Scene 1, line 290, where France talks to Cordelia, and he says, France is the king of France who's going to marry Cordelia, and he says, fairest Cordelia, thou art most rich, being poor. Wow, that sounds like a Christian sentiment within the bounds of the play, right? Within the pagan boundaries of the play. And this goes into what I meant by the play working on in terms of like a tri-locus, right? It works in the pagan prehistory, it works in the Renaissance Jacobean Christian court, and then it works in the modern day, right? He's saying, fairest Cordelia, thou art most rich being poor. In other words, she only receives by what she gives. Most choice forsaken, and most loved despised. Thee and thy virtues here I seize upon. Be it lawful, I take up what's cast away. Gods, 'tis strange that from their cold neglect my love should kindle to inflamed respect. Thy dowerless daughter, king, thrown to my chance, is queen to us of ours and of our fair France. Not all the dukes of warish Burgundy can buy this unprized precious maid of me. Bid them farewell, Cordelia, though unkind. Thou losest here a better where to find. Now, why is this little speech from France written in couplets? First of all, what's a couplet? Well, a couplet, I know you guys know this, but if you're watching this and you don't know, this is Shakespeare's form plus content equals meaning. Okay, the form of the play becomes iambic pentameter couplets, rhyming pairs of rhyming lines. Okay. The content here is he's saying that at the beginning of the speech, right? Poor, despised, upon, away, neglect, and then neglect, respect. It begins with unrhymed couplets. In other words, there are no couplets because we have France and we have Cordelia. They are two separate people. So their lines are unrhymed. But then what he does is he says, he falls in love with Cordelia. He falls in love with Cordelia because he realizes that she is true, she's giving, and that she's willing to give all for truth and for love. And because of that, he falls in love with her. He's going to marry her. So the moment that he says he's going to fall in love with her, that he loves her, the lines reflect this. The form reflects this because the lines rhyme. They become couplets. So we have the unification of two disparate characters, two entities who are united in love, right? And the meaning here is that love can be gleaned, love can come together through these two opposing characters because they are matched together by what she is willing to give. She is not willing to take, she wants to give. This is the kind of woman that he wants. Edmund's soliloquy. This is Act 1, Scene 2. This is the beginning of this is the plot, which is going to be moved forward through one of the subplots, at least, through Edmund and his Machiavellian machinations. Edmund says, this is his soliloquy. Remember, a soliloquy is essentially just a monologue, but it is a solo speech. So when a person speaks a soliloquy, only the audience can hear them. Usually this is accomplished in movies particularly well because we have the voiceover, which does not occur. I mean, you can do that now on a stage production, but it's especially useful in movies because we, the audience, can listen to the thoughts of the character. Edmund says, thou nature, capital N nature, thou nature art my goddess. Interesting. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom to permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother? Why bastard? Wherefore base, when my dimensions are all as well compact? My mind is generous and my shape is true as honest madam's issue. Why brand they us with base, with baseness, with bastardy, base? Who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating a whole tribe of fops, got tween asleep and awake? Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your hand. I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund as to the illegitimate. Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate. If this letter speed and my invention thrive, Edmund is the base, shall top the legitimate. I grow, I prosper. Now, gods, stand up for bastards, he says. In other words, Edmund says, nature, who is his goddess, has made him has made him just the same as Edgar. He's not like Richard III, right? He's not a hunchback. He's not like he's not oppressed by nature. He doesn't look any different from the others. There's no reason why he shouldn't have what Edgar has. He says, why is it that I just so happen to be born different, from a different dad or in a different place or in a different time than Edgar? We both have the same father, and we should both have the same thing. But because we don't, he says, I'm going to take what's his. And why does he call me base? Remember, he's not calling him base. He's calling him base. He says he's low. He's low down. He's a low down creature. Why should he be any different than Edgar? Well, because of that, he's going to make Edgar, his brother, his base on which he's going to stand. Now, we've talked about this a lot, right? The kind of idea of like two sorts of people. There's the one type of person that respects and loves their friends and has virtue, yes, and is willing to, you are all working, you're all living, you're all doing your thing, and your friend gives you an idea, and when you hit it big, when you find some success, you shout out your friend, right? You bring them along. You want to lift them up. You're being lifted up, so I'm going to lift up my friends because I'm true to my friends, is one type of person. Hopefully we all strive to be like that. I mean, hopefully that's the way I want to be. Who doesn't want to be like that, right? That's what friendship is. That's what love and friendship is, right? You give to others, and when you find some success, you bring them along with you. Then there's the other type of person who they got that thing from their friend, they got that idea from their friend, and now that's a way for them to sneak, right? For them to stab them right in the side when it comes to the testing time, right? Yeah. Screw your courage to the sticking place. And what do? They step on the faces of their friends. They step on the people that have brought them up. They step on others in order to make themselves rise above others. And that's exactly what Edmund is doing here. Now, the thing is that he's a villain because he's this Machiavellian new man because he is doing this purposefully. We need to go back and probably read some of Machiavelli's The Prince, because again, this is one of those books that is continuously referenced today. I mean, we've talked about this with 1984 and with we did Animal Farm. We've talked about a number of these sort of expressions that are used in the common everyday in the common parlance, right? But it's interesting going back and reading Machiavelli's The Prince and exactly what he says in the text, which is, remember in Machiavelli, he says that the prince he can rule by love or by fear, is what he says in the most famous passage. And that the prince, in Machiavelli's words, should rule with fear, because he says when a prince, and it's interesting, he's talking about prince, the prince in terms of the princes and principalities. When the oligarch, when the elites, when the powerful person, when the CEO rules with love, well, obviously that's virtuous. But in Machiavelli's words, what he says is essentially that, well, if you rule with love and you are crossed, if your friends cross you or something bad happens to you, well, your natural inclination is going to be to forgive them. And in that case, the prince will never have power. He says it's much more vital to the life of the principality that you rule with fear, because the people will fear you in that they may respect you, but they will not cross you because you are willing to be ruthless. Now, obviously, that's satanic, right? But this is sort of what Edmund is supposed to represent in the play. Gloucester's soliloquy. Let's go to page, let's see, this is still Act 1, Scene 2. Yes, I mentioned earlier that all Shakespearean plays are divided into 5 acts, right? And we have the arc of the narrative, which is slightly different in Shakespeare. where you have introduction, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, but it's not really like that. The plays you are actually divided into 3 acts in terms of their sort of, in terms of their metaphysical arc, right? Or the subtextual arc. But in terms of their action, all the plays are divided equally into 5 acts. You don't have any Shakespearean plays that are divided into 4 acts or 6 acts. They're all 5 acts. They can have an infinite number of scenes, but they are all 5 acts, right? It says, and here we go with, if you look at the text, it actually becomes prose right there. And why does Shakespeare sometimes veer into prose rather than poem, rather than verse? Well, verse, just to recap, verse is words written in lines. No matter what, the lines will always be the same. The first and the last word will always be the same. We have a line break. We talked about the real estate of a line of verse. We've talked about the best words in the best order. But he will veer into prose for a number of reasons. One would be, for instance, the porter in Macbeth, right? Where we have the contract, we have the comic relief. By the way, notice that in King Lear, there's no comic relief. The fool is supposed to be the comic relief if there is any comic relief. But the irony is that when the fool speaks, he actually speaks more truthfully and more profoundly than the way that the high characters speak. So there's no comic relief in King Lear, and that's one of the reasons why it's a relentless play. Macbeth has comic relief. Remember, the porter comes out and opens the door, and he gives the metaphor about drinking and what it does to you, right? And how it ruins, it can ruin your manhood and all this sort of stuff, right? But when the porter speaks in Macbeth, we have the contrast between the verse of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, because they're royals, they're highborn characters, and they speak the best words in the best order. They speak absolutely truthfully with purpose. But the porter speaks in prose because he's a low character, right? He's a pleb, he's a peasant, and because it's supposed to, one practical reason is because it is supposed to appeal to the groundlings who are watching the play. The groundlings, you may know this, the groundlings are basically the people who in the Globe Theater watch the play. You have the royals who sit on the stage. Then you have the other, rich or famous people who will watch the play, like from the balconies. And then you have the groundlings who are like low, and they're standing the whole time. And a Shakespearean play is not really what you think it is. I mean, it's not like a play now. It's actually it actually resembles more of a Greek idea of plays than a modern idea of a play, because without the religious ritual, because the Greek drama was a pure religious ritual, right? With masks, and meant to sort of, it was meant as an allegory. But the Renaissance play was more like going to a concert, bar, boxing event, whorehouse, shooting gallery than like a modern play. People didn't go and like sit down and watch the play the whole time. The groundlings were standing up. There was bear baiting, there was drinking, there was carousing, and there happened to be entertainment in the background, but they could kind of do what they want, right? It says, Gloucester says, "Oh, why does Gloucester speak in prose here? Because Gloucester's a highborn character. He's a noble. So why is he? Well, look at that. Why is he? Hold on, y'all. Got to fix myself. Why is he speaking in prose? Because let's see what he says. He says, these late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus." He says thus and thus because he's saying the sun and the moon. Shakespearean stage directions are often seamless within the text. Yet nature finds itself scourged by the secret effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide. In cities, mutinies. In countries, discord. In palaces, treason. The bond cracked twixt father and son. This villain of mine comes under the prediction. There's a son against father. The king falls from bias of nature. There's father against child. We have seen the best of our time. Machinations, hollowness, treachery, and all ruinous disorders follow us disquietly to our graves. Find out this villain, Edmund. It shall lose thee nothing. Do it carefully. And the noble and true-hearted Kent banished his offense, honesty, 'tis strange. Now, Gloucester is being taken advantage of by Edmund because Edmund has told him that hey, I've got a letter here. And the letter shows that look, you guys, there's a coup d'etat, right? There's a coup, and it's going to happen, and he fools his dad. Gloucester, right? And Gloucester speaks in this sort of hodgepodge of prose because what he's saying here is that nature is out of sorts, right? The time is out of joint. And he's essentially saying, look, man, everything that we thought we knew, right? Everything that we thought was ordered is now chaos. And that's supposed to mirror the chaos of Lear's mind and the chaos of events. He's saying there will come a time when fathers will turn against sons, when brothers will turn against brothers, friendships will fall, and that's what he's seen in the play. And it's interesting to consider that, although this is like this huge monumental play, and there's so much in it, we only get the end. We only get the last scene. We only get the last scene in Lear's life. We don't know what happened before it, right? We don't know what happened in the life of his children. We can imagine that it's bad. I mean, look at his family. But it's crazy because everything has been turned on end. Edmund says, this is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behavior we make guilty of our disasters, the sun, the moon, the stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treachers by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on, an admirable evasion of whoremaster's son to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star. My father compounded with my mother under the dragon's tail. So that's the constellation. And my nativity was under Ursa Major, so that it follows I am rough and lecherous. I should have been that I am, had the maidenliest star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing. In other words, he's saying when he was born, this is a nod to the current time. This is a nod to the contemporaneous, especially the Jacobean, the Elizabethan and the Jacobean tendency to cast one's fortune and one's astrology at the moment of a child's birth. And what he's saying here is they did this for Edgar, and they showed all the stuff that Edgar was going to do. And when they cast my stars, they showed that I would be thus. But guess what? He says, not only is the fault not in our stars, it's in ourselves. He says our agency is in ourselves. And it's crazy that in this moment, Edmund is kind of based. He talks about how he's base, but in this moment, he's kind of based, right? He's saying, look, man, even though it's for the wrong reasons, even though his agency is one to do wickedness and evil, he's saying he has the power to do it. He has free will. It's not in his astrology. It's not in his fate. He's going to decide what he's going to do. Now, of course, it's not based what he decides to do. He's a villain. The guy's sick. But what I'm saying is his worldview in this sense is sort of anti fatalistic, like everybody else in the play, this sort of pagan fatalism. Let's see. Skipping on to Lear's Shadow and the Fool. This is Act 1, Scene 4. Here, Lear has retreated to Goneril's castle, Um, and he's with his 100 knights, his dudes. It's just dudes being dudes. And he says, oh, and he's there with his fool, his shadow self. And the fool, and Goneril comes in, and the fool says, may not an ass know when the cart draws the horse? Which is the cart coming before the horse. Lear says, does any here know me? This is not Lear, speaking about himself in the third person. Does Lear walk thus, speak thus? Where are his eyes? Which is foreshadowing of Gloucester. Either his notion weakens, his discernings are lethargied. Ha! Waking, 'tis not so. Who is it that can tell me who I am? He doesn't know who he is. The fool says, Lear's shadow. This is really insightful. This is one simple line, right? It's 3 syllables. Lear's shadow. It's 3 syllables, which is completely out of joint with the normal, with the normal pentameter, right? With the normal 5-footed 10-syllable line, where the fool gives us an incredible insight into King Lear. Not only is Lear a shadow of his former self, and not only is the fool sort of this shadow, almost a Gnostic shadow self of Lear, but Lear himself is his own shadow. Lear says, I would learn that by the marks of sovereignty, knowledge, and reason, I should be false persuaded I had daughters. Fool says, which they will make an obedient father. Right. Do you see the inversion of nature here? Lear is saying, I should remember that I was a man and I had daughters. He's lost in his sort of dementia here, and he should remember that he had daughters. Right. And the fool says to him, oh yeah, you've got daughters and they're going to make an obedient father, which is the inversion of what Lear wanted with his daughters. One of the reasons why he divided up his kingdom was because he wanted to gauge their obedience. Yes. But here the fool is saying, no. Actually, they control you, right? The daughters are now controlling the father. Goneril comes in and says, Goneril comes in and basically orders the knights away and orders Lear out of the king. She kicks him out. So again, we have this inversion. It's interesting that, he's gone to retreat to Goneril and that she ends up kicking him out of the castle, out of the kingdom. I'm going to skip here to Act 3, Scene 2. And Lear says, he's speaking to Kent. Kent comes in disguise to serve him. Let's see. Let the great gods that keep this dreadful putter o'er our heads find out their enemies now. Tremble, thou wretch. Thou hast within thee undivulged crimes, unwhipped of justice. Hide thee, thou bloody hand, thou perjured, and thou similar of virtue. Thou art incestuous. Caitiff to pieces shake, that under covert and convenient seeming has practiced on man's life. Close pent-up guilts, rise your concealing continence, and cry these dreadful summoners grace. I am a man more sinned against than sinning. Kent says, alack, bareheaded, gracious my lord, hard by here is a hovel. Some friendship will it lend you against the tempest. Repose you there while I to this hard house, more harder than the stones whereof 'tis raised, which even but now demanding after you denied me to come in, return and force their scanted courtesy. Now, this again is a great example of Shakespeare's form plus content equals meaning. The repetition of the H sounds, which is it's subtle. This is subtle. This is the subtlety of Shakespeare's language. The repetition of the H sounds in the speech indicate both Kent's exasperation with Lear and also his inability to breathe. Kent is like run to catch up with Lear on the heath. The heath is like the barren wasteland where Lear has walked out into the storm with the fool, and he's like ranting against the storm. And Kent has run out there to catch up with him. So he's out of breath. So his words have to indicate that he's out of breath. Now, remember, Shakespeare doesn't really do stage directions. He doesn't need to, because the words themselves mirror the actions. This is why, like, words themselves tend to be onomatopoeia, right? The action of the words themselves indicate what the words are trying to convey. So the H sounds are an exasperation. They're out of breath. They are also the heaving of the heart, the lack of home. Lear has no more home. He's homeless, right? Because he's given up his home to his 3 daughters, one of whom he's kicked out of the kingdom. So now he's given up his home to 2 daughters. One of them has kicked him out of that place, and now he's got to go and find the other one. And Kent runs out here, and look at the words: hard, here, hovel, hard, house, harder. He's out of breath. Lear says, my wits begin to turn. Come on, my boy. How dost thou, my boy? Art cold? I'm cold myself. Where is thy straw, my fellow? The art of our necessities is strange and can make vile things precious. Come, your hovel. Poor fool and knave. I have one part in my heart that's sorry yet for thee. It can make vile things precious. I'm going to skip ahead here to, I'm going to skip to the blatant naming of devils and demons in the play. This is Act 3, Scene 4, and they mention the demon Flibbertigibbet. This is a name for a devil borrowed from Samuel Harsnet's Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostors from 1603, an attack on Catholics by exploiting popular belief in demonic possession. But remember that this is also at a time when King James, this is the Jacobean era, when King James obviously had become king. Remember, he wrote, 1547 Demonology. And so here we have the clear, we see clearly that Edmund and Edgar are playing around in the wilderness with these demons. That's why they go mad. Edgar says, this is the foul fiend Flibbertigibbet. And that name may sound ridiculous, okay? But that's because it's the ridiculous demon of tricksterism. It's playing tricks with his mind, right? It's telling him that what is what is not. It's telling him that what's right is wrong, right? What was vile is precious. Everything sort of becomes inverted as a result of Lear's, number one, as a result of Lear's madness, but as a result of what he's done to his family. He begins at curfew and walks till the first cock. He gives the web and the pin, squints the eye, and makes the hairlip, mildews the white wheat, and hurts the poor creature of the earth. Swiveled footed thrice the old. Okay, this perfectly mirrors the inversion of the threes that the witches do, the Weird Sisters in Macbeth, and the three inversion is supposed to be an inversion of the Trinity. He says, he met the nightmare, and her ninefold bid her a light, and her troth plight, and aroint thee, witch, aroint thee. Poor Tom that eats the swimming frog, the toad, the tadpole, the wall newt, and the water, that in the fury of his heart, when the foul fiend rages, eats cow dung for salads, swallows the old rat and the ditch dog, drinks the green mantle of the standing pool. Remember William Blake? Remember William Blake in Proverbs from Hell? William Blake said, don't drink the standing water. It contains poison. Who is whipped from tithing to tithing and stocked, punished, and imprisoned. Who hath had 3 suits to his back, 6 shirts to his body, horse to ride and weapon to wear. But mice and rats and such small deer have been Tom's food for 7 long years. Okay, and then Edgar, he's confronted by Edgar and Gloucester. Gloucester says, what? Hath your grace no better company? And Edgar says, the prince of darkness is a gentleman. Modo he's called, and Mayhew. Those are the names of 2 demons. So this isn't metaphorical. And what I find interesting is that in many productions of King Lear, a lot of times when we have sort of nonsensical sounding kind of gibberish or nonsense verse, the production will cut it out. They will excise that from the text. They'll omit it from the production without really an understanding of what Shakespeare's doing here. What he's doing here is he's speaking a sort of the juxtaposition here is between a light sounding sort of almost childlike nursery rhyme, right, with the utterly serious and profound demonic elements that they are trying to convey. In other words, these characters are crazy. They're insane, not just because like, oh, they're crazy and oh, their family has made them crazy. It's because they are literally being tormented by demons, right? And that's one of the purposes of the play. That's one of my, I talked about my thesis statement earlier, but one of the things I would say is that because King Lear, and I think scholars often miss this, because King Lear exists in this sort of pre-Christian pantheon of pagan gods out on this heath, the reason that he goes mad and the reason he goes crazy is because he is totally selfish, right? Cordelia is the contrast to that. Cordelia is selfless and willing to understand truth and virtue and to give up everything for it. Whereas Lear is this selfish character who only exists for his own pride and who is later tormented by hubris because he has no grounding, right? He does not go to God. He has no morals. His morals are all for himself and what he can get from other people. Even though he wants to give like to his daughters, he's not really giving. He's taking from them everything that they have. He's taking what makes him this sort of godlike character in the play. At least that's the way he thinks of it. He thinks that he is a pagan Celtic druidical god in the pantheon of Albion. He thinks that he can control all and that they owe him everything, right? But he doesn't understand what love is. He doesn't understand love. He doesn't understand God. He doesn't understand giving. And all he wants to do is take. And because of that, he's driven mad with frenzy. And even Edgar, who is an innocent character, is like bound up in this vicious circle of their family with this Machiavellian Beelzebub character, Edmund. But even Edmund at the end of the play, who, remember, was kind of based in that he believes in free will, is able to try and redeem himself. Now, it's because it's a Shakespearean tragedy and because it's life, the good guys, don't always win. And he suffers just like everybody else because he sees that what he set in motion can't be undone, and Cordelia dies. And then when King Lear sees that Cordelia dies, his heart dies, so King Lear dies. The title character has to die. And then Edmund dies. Right? And it's because they aren't able to get a grasp on what it means to be a human in terms of what it means to be virtuous. They certainly have a grasp. Shakespeare himself obviously has a grasp on what it means to be human in terms of how many people act, right? And again, I take this back to take any, wealthy individual who at the end of their life, towards the end of their life, writes their will or tells their children they're going to divide up their fortune amongst their 3 kids. And what do the kids inevitably do? They always turn on each other. Right? Why do they always do that? They always turn on each other. Can't they ever see that the guy who's leaving them their fortune is about to die and that they also will one day die? Don't they ever know that? Can't they ever get that? Lear says, I'll talk a word with this same learned Theban. What is your study? He talks to Kent and he calls him the learned Theban, which is obviously a direct reference to Oedipus Rex, right? The Theban trilogy, the Oedipal cycle, and the King of Thebes. It's interesting he doesn't call Gloucester that. He says that to Kent. Kent is one of the only guys that can see in the play. Kent, Albany, and even Edgar is blinded, but Kent and Albany are two of the guys who can actually see. Let's see. Moving on here to okay, so this is Act 4, Scene 1, really famous scene here. Gloucester says, okay, so Gloucester is held captive. He has Goneril and Regan over to his house, and he has Cornwall over to his house, who's the husband of one of the other girls, and they end up. Cornwall learns that Edmund has, written. He knows that Edmund has written this sort of fake coup letter, and they blame it on Gloucester. And so then they torture Gloucester and they gouge out his eyes because Gloucester says, "I can't see." Gloucester, to paraphrase, is like, I'll never be able to look on you again because you're all devils." And then Cornwall says, "You'll never be able to look at all." Right. And then he gouges out his eyes. So then Gloucester goes and he wanders out on the heath, sort of mirroring Lear. And when he gets out there, he finds Edgar. Edgar does a mock suicide. He takes him to the cliffs of Dover, and Gloucester's about to jump off the cliffs of Dover in despair. But Edgar says, take a step, and he sort of takes a step and he falls down. And he says, "What happened to me?" And Edgar says, "You jumped. But the gods brought you back. They blew their winds and they brought you back to life. Now you have a chance to live." And Gloucester says he has some reason else he could not beg in the last night's storm. I, such a fellow, saw, right? Because he can't see, which made me think a man a worm. My son came then into my mind, and yet my mind was then scarce friends with him. I have heard more since. Here's the famous quote. I love this quote. This quote is so amazing. And that quote that he just says, first of all, that man may think a man a worm. Shakespeare often talks, remember in one of his most famous sonnets, he talks about basically how, man becomes food for worms and, shuffling off that mortal coil, and man becomes food for worms. This, your body decomposes. But then when he says, and yet my mind was then scarce friends with him, that reminds me of Macbeth's, full of scorpions is my mind. Do you remember that part? And here he says, this is so amazing. He says, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Right? In other words, Gloucester's view is that we are just like little chunks of clay, and that the gods are up on Olympus and are sort of, we're like toys, we're like playthings to the gods, and they just, let us live or kill or get rid of us according to, their unknowable whims, right? Which is amazing because even he is too blind to see that you are not a product or a child of fate. You have free will, and that it was your son that did this to you. He had his own agency doing this, right? On page, let's see, this is Act 4, Scene 2. Albany confronts, this is Albany's little soliloquy, and then he confronts his wife, Goneril, who is just a real devil. By the way, when Cornwall gouges out the eyes of Gloucester, Goneril is sitting there watching. She just loves this. She wants it to happen. And one of the servants gets disgusted and he stabs Cornwall. Cornwall ends up dying from his injuries, thankfully. He stabs Cornwall and he says, "I can't let this be. What are you doing to this innocent man?" And then what happens to him? Well, she kills him. Albany says, wisdom and goodness to the vile seem vile. Filths savor but themselves. How true. How true is that? What more perfect statement could you have of wickedness, right? Notice that King Lear is not wise. He wants wisdom, right? He wants wisdom, but he doesn't have it. Now, one Gnostic reading of the text would say that King Lear achieves wisdom and redemption in this play through his sort of Job-like suffering, but he's not Job. He's not Job at all. And in fact, Harold Bloom points out, I mean, does he have any redemption at all? He sees his daughter Cordelia and he knows that he's done wrong and he dies and he's sort of woken up from his insanity. But he has set these events in motion. What have you done? Tigers, not daughters. What have you performed? A father and a gracious aged man whose reverence even the head-lugged bear would lick. Most barbarous, most degenerate have you madded. Interesting, he uses the word degenerate here. Could my good brother suffer you to do it? A man, a prince, by him so benefited? If that the heavens do not their visible spirits send quickly down to tame these vile offenses, it will come. Humanity must perforce prey on itself like monsters of the deep. And that's what Regan and Goneril are, right? They're like the Gemini twin monsters of the deep. They really are beasts of the abyss. Goneril says, milk-livered man. That reminds me of, again, that reminds me of Macbeth, right? With Lady Macbeth when she says, I have known what is to give suck, and I would while the infant, I would while he nursed from her woman's breast, pluck the boneless, her nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, she says. Or you're too full of the milk of human kindness. She says, milk-livered man that bearest. Interesting, the pun on the word bear here, because remember up above he said, even the head-lugged bear. And we also had Ursa Major as one of the guiding constellations in the play. The bear, a cheek for blows, a head for wrongs. Who has not in thy brows an eye discerning thine honor from thy suffering? An eye, illuminate, confirm. That not knowest fools do those villains pity who are punished ere they had done their mischief. Where's thy drum? France spreads his banners in our noiseless land. With plumed helm thy state begins to threat, whilst thou, a moral fool, she says, sits still and cries, alack, why does he so? Albany says, see thyself, devil. Proper deformity shows not in the fiend, so horrid as in woman. That's crazy. In other words, of course, it takes a deus ex machina, just like in Hamlet when Fortinbras and the Norwegians and or in Macbeth at the beginning when the Norwegian assault is thrown off. But when Fortinbras is trying to invade from the outside, of course, this serves two functions, right? We have the outside invader, which represents not only the geopolitical stratagems that go on within the court, but also the outside invader is supposed to be the reflection, right, of the inner assault that's occurring within the life of the court and also in the mind of King Lear. And he says, it's interesting, he says, see thyself, devil, because he's talking to her as if she is looking into the looking glass. The looking glass is the mirror, right? Of course, if Goneril was to look into the mirror, she would probably see the fractured mirror of her psyche, right? But she will never see her true self. Remember also in Julius Caesar, when Brutus and Cassius are talking and Brutus says, dost thou see thyself, right? It's interesting. An interesting concept that Shakespeare brings out is to think about the fact that we as human beings can never see ourselves. We're never able to see ourselves. You can't ever look and see yourself as another person sees you. You can look through a device. You can look through a video camera. You can look through a phone, but you can't ever see yourself except by reflection. And it's the reflection that makes the difference, because the reflection also means the figurative reflection or the spiritual or the religious reflection. By seeing yourself in the mirror, one has to also reflect upon one's inner self. Let's see. Yes, they end up killing Cornwall here. One of Lear's famous lines, Act 4, Scene 6, Edgar says, "Oh, matter and impertinency mixed, reason in madness." And Lear says, "When we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools. This, a good block. It were a delicate stratagem to shoe a troop of horse with felt. I'll put in proof, and when I have stolen upon these sons-in-laws, then kill, 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 kill. I mean, we've talked about the real estate, the important real estate of a line, a verse, but imagine Shakespeare giving, right, this 6-time monosyllabic expression, kill. And that's probably second to my favorite line of Shakespeare, of King Lear, which occurs in the end. I'm trying to find the line about women can only see themselves, are only old enough where they're never too old where they don't make faces in a mirror. But I can't quite, I'm not sure where that was. I got to find that. Yeah, but okay. So we're getting towards the end of the play here, you guys. Let's see. One of the themes in the play is the wheel of fortune, right? Which is, of course, one of the arcana in the tarot deck, but also the wheel of fortune, which is the contrast between what Lear says about fortune and fate and life. And that contrasts with Lear's worldview, which is that he is continuously thrown upon the rack and the screw, right? He always finds himself upon the wheel of fate or the wheel of fire. And of course, the wheel of fortune is supposed to resemble, in the Shakespearean sense, in the sort of John Dee, Enochian, Gnostic sense of the Renaissance would be, and the music of the spheres would be like, the fact that everything's cyclical or spherical, right? Or this would be like, this is almost like Al Crowley, Yeats' New Eon territory. Remember we covered Yeats and we talked about turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer in the Second Coming, where, it's essentially it's eternal return. And that's what King Lear sort of plays into. He thinks that like he starts here and life goes round, but he always ends up right back here on the wheel of fire. He says, let's see, Edgar says, my name is Edgar, and thy father's son. He confronts Edmund here at the end of the play. This is Act 5, Scene 3. The gods are just, and out of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. What is that in Macbeth? That's when Banquo, remember when the witches confront Banquo and Macbeth in Act 1, and Banquo says, oftentimes the instruments of darkness win us. Let's see. Oftentimes the instruments of darkness win us with honest trifles, only to betray us in deepest consequence. The gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where thee he got cost him his eyes. Edmund says, thou hast spoken right. 'Tis true. The wheel is come full circle. I am here. He faces his judgment, right? This is a reckoning. Albany says, methought thy very gait did prophesy a royal nobleness. I must embrace thee. Let sorrow split my heart if ever I did hate thee or thy father. He's talking to Edgar here, who's come back in disguise. Edgar says, by nursing them, my lord, list a brief tale. And when 'tis told, oh, that my heart would burst. The bloody proclamation to escape that followed me so near. Oh, our lives' sweetness, that we, the pain of death, would hourly die rather than die at once, taught me to shift into a madman's rags, to assume the semblance that very dogs disdained. And in this habit meaning his habit, how he's acting, his actions, but also his habit like a monk's habit, like his clothes. And in this habit met I my father with his bleeding rings, meaning his eyes are being gouged out. Their precious stones new lost, became his guide, led him, begged for him, saved him from despair. Never, O fault, revealed myself unto him until some half hour passed when I was armed, not sure, though hoping for his good success. I asked his blessing, and from first to last told him our pilgrimage. Interesting that he calls it a pilgrimage. And it's also interesting that Edgar does the exact reverse with his father, Gloucester, that Goneril and Regan do with King Lear, right? Because Goneril and Regan are given this stuff by their father, and then they take advantage of him and they become the masters. Edgar is sort of taken away from his father. He acts as master for his father, but it's to serve his father. But his flawed heart, alack, too weak, the conflict to support, twixt two extremes of passion, joy, and grief, burst smilingly. Edmund says, here's Edmund's change, his major shift. His the term for this in Italian literature is the volta. That's what occurs in the eighth or ninth line of the Petrarchan sonnet. It's called the volta, the shift. He says, this speech of yours hath moved me, and shall perchance do good. But speak you on. You look as you had something more to say. Albany says, if there be more and more woeful, hold it in, for I am almost ready to dissolve hearing of this. Imagine that. Edmund, who has brought on all of this. You know, I mean, Lear brought it on, but Edmund is the one who's brought on this whole coup aspect in the play, who has betrayed his father, betrayed his brother, betrayed his kingdom, betrayed all these people just for his own advancement, and actually listens and changes. It's the biggest, like Harold Bloom said, it's the biggest shift in any character in all of Shakespeare. He completely changes. He tries to redeem himself. He tries to be good. At the end, he says, he hath commissioned from thy wife and me to hang Cordelia in prison and to lay the blame upon her own despair that she did fordid herself. And then, so in other words, he says, I ordered Cordelia's death. Go and save her before it's too late. I'm the one who did it. And I blamed it on her. And I said that basically he S-sided her, right? And then Lear comes in and he says, howl, howl, howl. Oh, you are men of stones. Had I your tongues and eyes, I'd use them so that heaven's vault should crack. She's gone forever. He's holding his daughter in his arms. I know when one is dead and when one lives. So in other words, his madness has been seared away from him through absolute suffering. Before, his suffering was a false suffering. He was suffering for himself. But now he does undergo sort of a transformation and redeem himself, because it's at the moment of actual suffering, when he's lost the thing that he realized he cared about the most, right, that he actually breaks. And he realizes, no, I can discern truth from reality. I know when one is dead and when one lives. What a perfect line of iambic pentameter, right? All monosyllabic words. I know when one is dead and when one lives. The emphasis is obviously on the last word, lives. She's dead as earth. Lend me a looking glass, if that her breath will mist or stain the stone. Why then she lives. And, this is kind of, it's interesting. He sort of gives an Enochian, John Dee sort of, let's look into the looking glass mirror here to see if she lives by misting up. Now, of course, there's a practical effect. He says, if she's still breathing, hand me the mirror. And if she breathes on the glass and we see some mist, then we'll know she lives. But he's also, what Shakespeare's doing here is he's also saying, lend me the looking glass so that I can look into myself. I can look into myself to see if she lives, if she still lives in my heart, and if I still live. It says, let's see, she's dead, or image, Edgar says, or image of that horror. Lear says, this feather stirs, she lives. If it be so, it is a chance which does redeem all sorrows that ever I felt. Lear says, a plague upon you murderers, traitors all. I might have saved her. Now she's gone forever. Cordelia, Cordelia, stay a little. What is't thou sayest? Her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in woman. I killed the slave that was a hanging me. Then he finds out that, Lear burst in and killed the guy that was hanging her, right? Her executioner. And then he says, this is my favorite part of the whole play. Messenger comes in and says, Edmund is dead, my lord. Edmund, who ordered the execution and then received some sort of redemption, sort of, at the end, is now dead. Albany says, that's but a trifle here. You lords and noble friends know our intent. What comfort to this great decay may come shall be applied. For us, we will resign during the life of this old majesty to him our absolute power. You to our rights with boot and such addition as your honors have more than merited. All friends shall taste the wages of their virtue, and all foes the cup of their deserving. So true. Oh, see. And then in comes Lear. And my poor fool is hanged. They hanged his fool. His shadow self is dead. His wiser self is dead. His heart is dead. He is dead. No life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou come no more. This is my favorite line in all of Shakespeare. Well, besides what Macbeth says, I bear a charmed life, right? This is my favorite line of Shakespeare. Never, right? 5 repetitions of a disyllabic word in trochaic pentameter, which is the inverse, the reverse of the normality of nature. Pray you undo this button. Thank you, sir. Do you see this? Look on her, look, her lips. Look there, look there. And then he dies. King Lear dies. It's interesting that he dies by looking. Gloucester looked and his eyes were ripped out. Everybody in this play looks, but they cannot see. King Lear looked, but he was looking, but he could not see. And then in the end, look there. And of course, remember, he's got the mirror in front of him. He's looking into himself. So he realizes that his daughter is his heart. Now, it's up to interpretation whether the play ends with any sort of redemption. Do you think that he was redeemed in the end? I think that in a sense he was redeemed, but he's also, it's too late. Right? It's too late for him. Edmund probably has some redemption, even though he ordered the death of Cordelia. But again, what this play shows is that when you traffic and truck in the selfish, the occult, and the insane, when all you do is take, in the end, that's what happens, right? His heart is finally taken away from him. And it is too late, and he dies looking. So that's about it, guys. That's my King Lear analysis. Quite an epic, right? I mean, quite an epic. I mean, it is an immense play. And I got to say, this one is daunting. This is, I consider myself pretty good with Shakespeare. And this play is really, it's difficult. This one is difficult for me. It's difficult. Again, it's difficult literally and figuratively. It's difficult in the sense that it's difficult to comprehend in a literal sense, all the ins and outs, all the comings and goings of all of the characters. Even though I've read it, a number of times, but it's also difficult in terms of its comprehension, but the brilliance of Shakespeare is that it is purposefully that way. Nothing in Shakespeare is accidental. If you replace one word or one syllable in a line of verse with something, more digestible to a modern ear, you ruin the entire structure of the house. You ruin the integrity of it. It is meant to exist as it is. And you can omit, but you cannot change or add. And, that's what verse accomplishes. That's That's the whole purpose of poetry, right? Is that, when people say, oh, I don't read poetry or whatever, and that's fine. That's cool. Okay. But it's not meant to be read like you're reading a novel. It's not the same. It's not even the same universe. It's not even the same cosmos. The whole purpose is that you take everything and that it is boiled down to its essence. When Lear says those words, never, 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 it could never be said better. At that moment, at the climax of his grief, there is no other word or phrase or line of verse that could possibly come close to that. So let's see if we got any little super chats here. Let's see. Sweet, we got one. We got $10 from our homeboy Thomas Henderson. Thank you so much, Thomas Henderson. Really appreciate you as always. Our high IQ homeboy out there. Thank you for supporting the stream. Thank you for being here. Thanks for always being here and for being in all of our circles and channels here. And always appreciate seeing you, homeboy. And thank you so much for supporting me. That really means a lot to me. Thank you so much. Let's see. Corey S. says, for any $5, it's $5. Thank you, Corey. For any good MK Ultra S books you know of. Thanks, BLA. Yeah, MK Ultra books. Depends what you're asking for. Are you asking for nonfiction or, look, I'll give you my nonfiction references, and maybe I can throw in a couple of fiction, a couple of works of fiction. Because actually, usually I would recommend nonfiction in terms of that kind of material. I've said before, like how in my own life, I tend to read nonfiction more. You may not believe it because what we cover here is, literature, right? But in my own life, I tend to read nonfiction way more. I barely read novels. And obviously nonfiction gives us an insight into truth that fiction can't. But at the same time, the flip side of that, it's a flip side to that coin. What if you do got me boxed in? Because I will not hesitate, not for a second. Right? I got a woman. What are you, a monk? If you can name that movie, I will be very impressed what that was from. Yeah. So, but fiction can also do that. Obviously, we just covered Firestarter. We covered the film and the text. Now, ordinarily, of course, I would not recommend Creeper Stephen King, but Firestarter is a great insight into MK Ultra. One of the best that I know of in terms of fiction. There are so many great works, especially nonfiction on MK Ultra. I'd say the best works on MK Ultra that you could possibly read. Of course, you should go to the Kang of all this stuff. Go to Jay Dyer and Jay's analysis and the Globalist book series. He covers all this in depth and in detail, way more than I, could begin to. But I would say that just right off the top of my head, yes, Heat, great job, awesome, adaptable, adapt a Red, adapt, and adopt a Red Bull. Okay, yes, it was Heat, very good, thank you, appreciate you. For MK Ultra, I would recommend, of course, this book right here, John Marks and the Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which is one of the books on MK Ultra. I'd recommend the Monarch book by Marshall Thomas, Monarch, the New Phoenix Program, one of my personal favorites about MK Ultra and Monarch. I would recommend, of course, Jay's Esoteric Hollywood. Program to Kill by Dave McGowan has bits about MK Ultra. The Ghost of Langley by John Prados. I recommend Mind Wars. I would recommend The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot is a great book on MK Ultra. Anything by dealing with Estabrooks, Lewis Jolyon West, Martin Orne, Jose Delgado, all deal with MK Ultra. The Phoenix Program by Doug Valentine, which I've got up here somewhere. Where is that? Where's my Phoenix Program book? Oh, Phoenix Program book right here by Valentine deals with MK Ultra. Um, some great films. Yeah, Mind War. This one is called Mind Wars. That's different from Mind War Psy War, which is Michael Aquino, but that also, of course, deals with that from the inside with MK Ultra and Monarch. The biography of Mengele deals with I think it's the Angel of Death is the name of it. Deals with trauma bonding. Also, Colin Ross, the psychiatrist. You can read Colin Ross's books about Monarch and MK Ultra. They deal with that. Some great movies that deal with that would be again Firestarter. I mean, Stranger Things deals with Monarch. Another good one is Possessor by the film by Brandon Cronenberg, the son of David Cronenberg, which is a dark. I mean, this is dark stuff. But Possessor gets it in a way that sort of deals with DID and the occult that is sort of different than all the other works. I mean, there are a number of different things with MK Ultra. Candy Jones, the real Candy Jones, the book about Candy Jones is a good one. Let's see what else. I mean, it depends on what aspect of Monarch of MK Ultra you're dealing with. Are you talking about the sub projects? Are you Sid Gottlieb? You should read the new biography of Sidney Gottlieb, the black magician, the sorcerer of MK Ultra. Would be a great read. Anything dealing with ZR Rifle or Operation Midnight Climax. There was a book that came out. I mean, there's a movie that came out recently about Midnight Climax and the operations in San Francisco that I haven't seen, which might be good. There's the movie American Ultra, which is, it's like a pop version of that, which kind of deals with that. I tend to stay away from anything that deals with like, MK Ultra as, LSD experimentation. That kind of thing is kind of bullshit and lame. And it's like sort of a normie way of looking. And now that is an essential part of it, but it's sort of a normie level of looking at this stuff. Really, I think that you would be better off looking at anything that dealt with the sub projects or with the thing that I find most fascinating is MK Delta and the Super Soldier program, which is a real thing. I mean, the Winter Soldier deals with that. That's what the Winter Soldier is about, right? With Bucky Barnes is MK Delta programming. There's probably still some stuff online that you can find. And videos about that. Of course, go to Kristen at Slowboy Whiteboard. She's got material on it. You can go to what is it? LOL Field and Love, which is the channel that has all of the Dave McGowan Program to Kill videos and Phoenix Program videos that deals with MK Ultra. So that's quite a lot of material. The movie that started with a P from earlier. Oh, I don't even know what I said. I don't know. You'll have to rewind. I said a bunch of stuff. Yeah, but so I guess that's a kind of a plethora of material. As far as fiction goes, I don't know. I'll have to think about that some more because a lot of this stuff it hasn't filtered into fiction very well. You're better off with nonfiction. And again, for a complete list, just get Esoteric Hollywood and Esoteric Hollywood 2, right? And go to Jay's analysis and look at the Globalist book series. So I hope that helps. Let's see. $10 for my homeboy, Nick at the Green Feathers. Shouts out to Nick. Everybody go to the Green Feathers on YouTube, the Green Feathers. Check out his streams, his art streams, his music streams, his all of his streams, all of his material. We are lucky to have such a high IQ and friendly and awesome and amazing homeboy out there. Really appreciate you supporting me. So thank you so much. And you guys will see me and Nick and our homeboy Jerry maybe tomorrow. I don't think tomorrow. It'll be Wednesday. I forget what we said. I think it'll be Wednesday. discussing H.P. Lovecraft. We have a sponsored stream. Our homeboy Jack out there dropped $100 for me to cover H.P. Lovecraft. And so I've been reading into Lovecraft, and it's really taken a lot because, I don't know Lovecraft very well. So that's why I'm getting my homeboys, Nick and Jerry, to help me out because they are based analyzers themselves and are experts on this. If you are interested in me covering something in depth, donating, many hours to looking into it and research, please think about donating $100. And I know that's a lot of money for anybody out there. I mean, shit, $10 is a lot of money now, right? Just trying to make money. But think about doing that, and I will cover any book or work that you want me to. I mean, within reason. And of course, if you want me to cover any music or a music analysis or lyrics or an album, drop some fat super chats, and I will think about doing that. So thank you again to Nick. My sister says. She says, thank you to my sis out there who donated $10. And she said she watched my stream on the Crucible with Jerry and Andrew, and it was definitely eye-opening. And she's proud of me. Thank you so much. I love you. And have fun in Nashville. Yes. And thank you so much for that. Oh, look, shouts out to our homeboy Stephen Mulroney out there who drops $10 on PayPal. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Thank you so much for supporting me. And I think that is it. So, yes, you guys, please think about supporting me, dropping some fat super chats anytime. I really need your support, of course. Hopefully, I will see you or many of you this weekend in Nashville. I'll be getting in there Saturday, early Saturday, and I'll see you at the JD event in Nashville, where we'll be going to his book release, and we'll be hanging out, and I hope to meet everybody. It's going to be fun, y'all. How awesome is it that we have this great, tight community where we can all hang out and see each other in person and not just online. So, yes, please think about supporting me. I got to get all the way from VA to Nashville, many hours of driving. We all know what the gas is doing now. So, got to pay them bills, got to pay that rent. And of course I love doing this, and I love covering the material, and I hopefully you find this rewarding, and hopefully you find it rewarding, fun, and something to listen to, something to do at the very least on a Monday night. And again, I'll be here again, I guess, almost certainly tomorrow night. Probably going to be going hard this week. We're probably going to be streaming every night this week, just to, try and pump out some good content before we head off to Nashville. So thank you again, everybody. I love y'all. I will see you soon, and hope you have a good night. Peace, everybody. Have a good week. Peace.